Alaska is facing a food supply crisis, and Donald Trump's reckless trade war is to blame. While Americans struggle with soaring grocery prices nationwide, Alaskans are staring down a nightmare scenario that could push their already sky-high food costs into catastrophic territory. We're talking about a state where groceries already cost 36% more than the lower 48, now facing the prospect of supply chain disruption that could leave families unable to afford basic necessities. This isn't theoretical, it's happening right now, and Trump's chaotic approach to international relations has turned America's closest ally into an adversary wielding economic weapons against American citizens. So how did we get here? And why are Alaskans paying the price for Trump's diplomatic failures? To understand this crisis, we need to look at just how fragile Alaska's food supply really is. Alaska imports roughly 95% of its food, making it one of the most food-insecure states in the nation. Unlike the continental United States, where disrupted supply chains might mean switching suppliers or routes, Alaska has limited options. The state relies on three main arteries for food delivery: ocean shipping, air cargo, and trucking through Canada via the Alaska Highway. Ocean shipping handles about 90% of Alaska's cargo, but it's slow and seasonal. Air cargo is fast but expensive and limited in capacity. That leaves trucking, which handles only about 4% of Alaska's food imports but carries the most critical supplies. Fresh produce, emergency medical supplies, and time-sensitive goods all depend on trucks rumbling up the Alaska Highway through Canada. This is where Trump's trade war becomes a direct threat to American families. In February 2025, Trump imposed sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, claiming it was about border security and drug trafficking. The move violated the USMCA trade agreement that Trump himself negotiated during his first term.
The world is changing rapidly. The largest economy, the United States, is fundamentally reshaping all of its trading relationships. And we're moving from an age that lasted decades, an age when free trade was a motor of global economic growth, to a new age, an age of economic nationalism and mercantilism. You know, the U.S. tariff rate is now the highest it has been since the Great Depression in the 1930s. And these tariffs are being applied to all countries on nearly all goods. And the changes in U.S. policy go beyond tariffs. Countries now must in effect buy access to the world's largest economy through investments, through unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets. And all the while, the transformation of global trade is occurring against a backdrop of wider economic disruptions, of geopolitical realignment, of AI and other technological transformations, and the necessity, the imperative of a shift to a greener economy. What's going on?
What followed was a predictable cascade of economic retaliation that trade experts had warned about from the beginning. Canada had no choice but to respond, and their strategy revealed a sophisticated understanding of pressure points in the American economy. British Columbia Premier David Eby announced legislation that would allow the province to impose tolls on commercial trucks traveling from the lower 48 to Alaska through Canadian territory. This isn't just political posturing, it's economic warfare targeting the most vulnerable link in Alaska's supply chain. The Alaska Highway, built during World War II as a strategic defense route, has become Alaska's Achilles heel in Trump's trade war. The 1,187-mile highway stretches from Dawson Creek, British Columbia, to Delta Junction, Alaska, passing through some of the most remote territory in North America. There's no alternate route. Trucks carrying fresh produce to Walmart's 7 Alaska locations, emergency medical supplies to rural hospitals, and construction materials for critical infrastructure projects all depend on this single road through Canada. When Premier Eby threatens tolls, he's not just threatening corporate profits, he's threatening the ability of Alaskan families to feed themselves. The numbers tell a stark story. Alaska already has food prices second only to Hawaii. A recent federal study found that Anchorage residents pay 36% more for groceries than Americans in the lower 48. In rural Alaska, where food must be flown in, prices can be double or triple what Americans pay elsewhere. Now imagine adding Canadian tolls on top of Trump's tariffs. We're looking at a compounding crisis where each retaliatory measure makes food more expensive and harder to obtain. The Federal Emergency Management Agency commissioned a 2023 report that described Alaska's food supply chain as unique and vulnerable to disruption. That report identified the Alaska Highway as a critical vulnerability, noting that even small disruptions could have cascading effects on food availability and prices. Trump's trade war has turned that vulnerability into a weapon pointed directly at American families. But the crisis goes beyond just higher prices. Alaska's food supply chain operates on razor-thin margins and just-in-time delivery. Walmart, which supplies a significant portion of Alaska's fresh produce, uses specialized trucks with 2-driver teams to minimize transit time through Canada. Any delay or additional cost threatens this delicate system. If tolls make trucking uneconomical, Alaska could face actual food shortages, not just higher prices. The human impact is already being felt. Alaska State Senator Robert Myers, who also works as a commercial trucker, warned that Canadian tolls would be a big deal for fresh produce delivery. Jamie Benson, executive director of the Alaska Trucking Association, said the measures would significantly increase transportation costs, disrupt supply chains, and raise prices for essential goods that Alaskans rely on. These aren't abstract economic concerns, they're warnings about Ute families being priced out of basic nutrition. The irony is devastating. Trump claimed his tariffs would protect American workers and strengthen American security. Instead, he's created a crisis that threatens the food security of American citizens in one of our most strategically important states. Alaska's location makes it crucial for defense against threats from Russia and China. Yet Trump's reckless diplomacy has turned our closest ally into an economic adversary, weakening both our security and our citizens' well-being. The situation has become so dire that Alaska's state legislature passed a bipartisan resolution opposing restrictive trade measures or tolls that would harm the unique relationship between Canada and Alaska. In a rare display of unity, Alaska lawmakers are pleading with both the Trump administration and the Canadian government to step back from this destructive path. The resolution notes that Alaska exports almost $600 million in goods to Canada annually, while importing more than $750 million. At least 2,300 Alaska jobs depend on trade with Canada. These aren't just numbers, they represent families whose livelihoods are threatened by Trump's diplomatic incompetence. What makes this crisis particularly infuriating is how predictable it was. Trade experts warned that Trump's tariff threats would provoke retaliation. Canada's response was measured and targeted, designed to inflict maximum political pressure while minimizing harm to Canadian interests.
The second major initiative that we're announcing today is a new $5 billion strategic response fund to help Canadian businesses adapt, diversify, and build that new economy. This fund has 3 core objectives. First, to help businesses pivot to new products and markets. Secondly, to retrain and retain skills and production here in Canada. And thirdly, to make our businesses globally competitive. So businesses can use these funds to invest in the design of new products, to retool their plants to boost productivity, or to offset the costs of accessing new markets. And the fund will be open to all sectors, given the fact that the tariff impacts are wide-ranging across Canadian industries. La priorité sera accordée aux projets issus des secteurs les plus touchés par les tarifs, comme l'acier, l'aluminium, l'automobile et le bois d'œuvre. Les fonds de réponse stratégique travaillera en étroite collaboration avec nos nouvelles alliances sectorielles pour s'assurer que ces projets d'investissement ne soient pas freinés par les défis du marché du travail. Grâce à une meilleure corrélation entre les travailleurs et l'industrie, nous pourrons former efficacement et jumeler les travailleurs aux nouveaux emplois dans le secteur de demain. The third major thing we're announcing today is a comprehensive Buy Canadian policy. We are on a mission to build Canada strong through major infrastructure projects.
The Canadian government has unveiled comprehensive measures, including a $5 billion strategic response fund, to help their businesses adapt, new Buy Canadian procurement policies, and support for 50,000 workers through retraining programs. They're protecting their economy while strategically applying pressure to vulnerable American supply chains. By threatening Alaska's food supply, Canada is forcing Americans to confront the real-world consequences of Trump's trade war. The targeting is surgical and effective. Alaska is a red state that voted for Trump, yet its residents are now paying the price for his failures. The broader implications are even more troubling. Trump's approach to international relations treats allies like enemies and negotiations like reality TV drama. His constant threats and reversals, he's delayed tariffs multiple times only to reimpose them, create the kind of uncertainty that destroys business relationships and supply chains. Companies need predictability to plan investments and operations. Trump's chaos makes long-term planning impossible, forcing businesses to prepare for the worst-case scenario. This isn't just about Alaska. Trump's trade wars are creating inflation pressures across the American economy. His tariffs on Canadian goods will raise prices for American consumers and businesses that rely on Canadian inputs. The Tax Foundation estimates that Trump's tariffs will cost American households an average of $1,300 annually. For Alaska families already struggling with high costs, this additional burden could be catastrophic. The timing couldn't be worse. Alaska is still recovering from the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which devastated the state's tourism industry and disrupted supply chains. The state's oil-dependent economy faces long-term challenges as global energy markets shift. Now, Trump's trade war threatens to undermine one of the few stable elements of Alaska's economy, its trade relationship with Canada. The solution should be obvious: end the trade war, respect international agreements, and restore normal diplomatic relations with Canada. But Trump's ego and political calculations seem to matter more than American families' ability to afford groceries. He's turned trade policy into a weapon for domestic political theater, regardless of the human cost. The Canadian response has been measured but firm. Prime Minister Mark Carney has made clear that Canada will defend its interests while keeping the door open for negotiation. But trust, once broken, is hard to repair. Even if Trump eventually backs down, the damage to the U.S.-Canada relationship could last for years. Companies will remember this crisis when making future investment decisions. The uncertainty Trump has created will have lasting effects on supply chains and trade relationships. For Alaska families watching grocery prices soar and worrying about food availability, Trump's trade war isn't about abstract economic policy. It's about whether they can afford to feed their children. It's about whether rural communities will have access to fresh produce and medical supplies. It's about whether Alaska's unique position as America's northern frontier will be sustainable in the face of deliberate policy choices that prioritize political posturing over practical governance. The crisis also reveals the hollow nature of Trump's America First rhetoric. How is it America First to threaten the food security of American citizens? How does it serve American interests to turn our closest ally into an adversary? How does it strengthen America to make our most strategically important state more vulnerable to supply chain disruptions? The answer is that it doesn't. Trump's trade war serves Trump's political interests at the expense of American families and American security. This is what happens when foreign policy becomes reality TV. Real families in Alaska are paying the price for Trump's diplomatic failures. They're the ones who will struggle to afford groceries, who will worry about whether fresh food will be available, who will bear the costs of their president's inability to maintain basic diplomatic relationships. Alaska's food crisis is a preview of what Trump's second term holds for America. More chaos, more uncertainty, more policies that sound tough but actually weaken American security and prosperity. The question isn't whether Trump's approach will eventually succeed, it's how much damage American families will suffer before sanity prevails. For Alaskans, that damage is measured in empty grocery shelves and unaffordable food prices.
has changed in recent months. So in May, right after the election, 29% of Canadians said the issue they were most concerned about were the U.S. tariffs, just right at the top there. This was followed by 11% concerned about inflation, 7% about health care, and 6% about taxes. Well, let's compare that to August and where things were then, where public opinion has shifted significantly. The top concern for Canadians now is inflation and cost of living. That's at 44%. It's followed by housing and job creation, both at 24%, and then U.S. trade, with 23% saying it should be the priority of the government. Well, joining me now to talk about all of this is Sébastien Dallaire, the Executive Vice President of the Eastern Canada team at Leger. He can walk us through these numbers better than I can. Sébastien, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being here, sir.
Always a pleasure.
All right, so let's look at the shift from May to August. What do you think has attributed to this change in the public's priorities and the public mood?
Interestingly, what we're seeing is a return to pre-Trump, pre-election concerns. For the past 2 years before this, it was about affordability, cost of living, access to housing, and this is what we're seeing again. What is different is now Trump, compared to where we were a few months ago, where everybody was worried about Trump, there was a lot of fear. Now Trump is the main backdrop to the same concerns that were there about a year ago. So the context has shifted quite a bit, but those concerns are very much the same.
Meanwhile, polling data shows that Canadians have shifted their focus from Trump-related concerns to domestic economic priorities, with inflation and cost of living now topping their list of worries at 44%. The irony is clear. While Trump's trade war was meant to strengthen America's position, it has instead unified Canada in protecting their own interests, while American families suffer the consequences, all because their president couldn't figure out how to work with America's closest ally,